Hello and welcome back to Morning Shot. I wish this was my studio, but it's not. We are here at Sakeliga, who are spending all our lovely money on making great content. I'm here with Piet, the CEO.
Hi, Ramon.
And my friend, and Russell Lamberti, the Executive Director.
Good to be here, Ramon. Yeah, good to have you here.
No, thank you for the invitation. It's just mostly to mock my studio setup, because this is far better. Speaking of far better, chaps, it's the end of 2023. Next year's a huge election. What are our concerns? What are people thinking about in this election? And most importantly, what they shouldn't be thinking about? Because I don't think it's our 1994. I just see a continuation of a little bit of chaos and anarchy that we're currently experiencing. What is Sakeliga's response to this potential seismic political event? But I think it's going to be a damn squib, though. What are we thinking here?
Sakeliga's strategy is to create a favorable environment for business. So that's our goal. And in South Africa, that means solving state failure at scale. So every day when we come into Sakeliga, we think about how do we solve state failure at scale? And we do that either through litigation or we do that through the creation of alternative structures. And part of that is not changing the party in charge. There are entities who are very much focused on that. And they've been having success in some places across South Africa. And I think they will keep continuing having success, but maybe not at the rate many people hope. But there are entities and political parties and lots of energy being put into that. We think our marginal benefit lies in the word we often use at Sakeliga, which is state-proofing. So we have to have a strategy for creating a favorable environment for business in the public interest that is state-proof, that is not dependent on the outcome of the next election, but in fact that is election-proof. And that doesn't mean that no harm will come from it. It doesn't mean that we'll be able to prevent all harmful intervention or compensate for all state failure. But from our perspective, if the political environment improves, that's wonderful. It's certainly much easier to work with some mayors than other, with some political parties than other. We experience that in the areas where we have associated chambers of commerce or where we have interactions. But as far as Sakeliga is concerned, we must reckon on a sustained presence of the ANC for the foreseeable future, a sustained presence of ANC-employed people in the civil service where 55,000 people already earn $1 million plus a year. They have existing political affiliations and views, and it's not just an election and then we have a new functional state. So important as it may be, it's not going to be all change everything soon, and business has to seize the opportunity to have solutions in the meantime.
Yeah, I think we've all gone through the New Dawn phase. Well, some of us. No one in this room, but people outside this room believed in the New Dawn. And 2024 is not the New Dawn. But Russ, a question for you. If we assume that the sort of chaos of ANC rule in coalition or otherwise is going to continue, we're already seeing real and drastic diminishing of state power, especially in the last 2-3 years. Transnet is basically dead. Eskom can't solve anything. Does this give you hope that alternatives can be found throughout the life cycle of this chaos that we're going through? What are your thoughts on this?
We like to say that state failure is one of our biggest threats and one of our biggest opportunities. It can be an opportunity, but you have to be organized and you have to have a plan. If you don't have a plan for state failure, what you get when the state fails is vacuums. You get nothing. When the railway track gets stolen, then you don't have a railway track, and there's no new one that gets built, so you don't have trains. So so we shouldn't be glib about state failure. It is a massive threat. Whether they should or shouldn't, the fact is that the state has been and is in control of so many coordination functions of society. And South Africa is a big state. You know, the National Party handed over a very big state to the ANC. The ANC has possibly made it bigger. I think, you know, all things considered, it's been made bigger, clunkier, you know, less efficient in many ways, a huge payroll, very, very bloated state-owned enterprises. So it's become this behemoth. And so, yes, we want it to recede, but a shrinking state is very different to a failing state. A shrinking state where you elect, I don't know, you know, Margaret Thatcher, and she comes in and she cuts that department, she cuts Fat Charo there, and she deregulates, you know, a bunch of functions, and the state, you know, perhaps, you know, shrinks a bit. That's one thing, but failure is a whole different ballgame, because who replaces those functions? And the answer is a spectrum from criminals and gangsters all the way through potentially to good community organizations, private businesses, non-profits, you know, the full range of organizational capacity, let's say, good and bad. So the simple hard reality is that as we go into 2024, we've got accelerating state failure. It's not clear to me that the election slows that down. I certainly don't think it changes the trajectory and turns it for the positive. If anything, I think next year could, you know, there's a bunch of scenarios in the election next year, but to my mind, you know, we're not political analysts, but to my mind, most of those scenarios point to a less functional state. Either you've got a continuation of the status quo now, which, you know, that's a fairly easy trend to kind of predict, or you have some range of coalitions, you know, and you know, it could be ANC EFF, it could be some are talking ANC DA. There's all sorts of, you know, scenarios that play out, but in one way or another, most of them seem to be pointing to deep factionalism, lots of fighting. It's not 1994, but it is a very significant election. The ANC looks like it's going to go below 50. Some would disagree. The polls, you know, show varying things. But let's say that happens. That's a pretty big landmark event, I think. Just symbolically, it means that they, you know, don't have the majority in Parliament, which has implications for who they partner with, who gets to have influence. So there's a whole lot of new things that we're going to see next year. So I think it's sort of silly to say, well, it's meaningless. We carry on. The politics is going to get shaken up next year. Provinces are up for grabs. A place like Gauteng is very, you know, hotly contested. The Western Cape, there's some interesting dynamics there because the DA is maybe not as dominant as they think, and so maybe they have to, you know, create some coalitions. And so, you know, there's a whole spectrum of things. Can we see that leading to capably led state apparatuses that start pulling out from the nosedive? You know, that's just, I think, it's a long shot. As Pete says, you don't plan for that, and if it happens, you be pleasantly surprised. You know, if certain functions can start righting themselves, that can be a positive. There's certain functions that we actually want the state not to run, and so we then need to make sure that if it's failing in those functions, that we're able to replace those functions with proper order. So that's kind of how we see the state failure landscape. There is a big opportunity to move into areas where the state is failing with really, really good solutions, better solutions than the state has been able to create. Sure. More decentralized solutions, perhaps more diverse solutions across different parts of the country because the problems are different around the country. Trying different things, something works in Hoedspruit but maybe doesn't work in the Free State, or, you know. So just whether it's security solutions, infrastructure solutions, there's a lot going on. I think what people, it's a long answer, so I'll wrap it up now, but what people, I think, should realize, so most people read their news feeds, they generally are reading kind of mainstream news or Twitter, which is almost becoming like a sort of mainstream news feed, or social media. What they're not often seeing enough of is the countless initiatives that are happening on the ground, which don't seem like much day to day, but I really think are adding up to a lot over 3, 5, 7 years. Across the country, dozens, hundreds of local community organizations, farm watches, security initiatives, energy initiatives, infrastructure repair initiatives. The Sakeliga is doing what we do, the various organizations doing what they do, getting all these small wins and sometimes big wins, day in and day out, week in and week out, month in and month out, over time is actually, I think, becoming very meaningful. And so people must just lift their eyes from their phones and realize that out there, there is chaos too, but there is some really good stuff happening. And getting behind that stuff, getting involved in that stuff, I think is, what else can you do? And I think there's really good stuff happening there.
So a small thing like that is, we went, myself and Chris Becker, who's a mutual friend, went to a local public park, excuse me, in the middle of Johannesburg, and we sort of just fenced off a portion of it. And now there are patrols once a week in that portion of the park, and it's safe and clean. And, the one little fifth of the park now is somewhere that people can go to have a good time.
Yeah. Is that Delta Park?
That's right.
So
that's going to be expanded soon, right? But so you have the smallest, narrowest point of order, and then you expand it.
Yes. And the issue at Delta Park is what? Squatting and
trash, squatting,
vagrants
everywhere. Yeah, huge.
Yeah, huge and the city's not dealing with it basically.
Not in the slightest.
Yeah.
Ironically, the city's quite happy for us to do it if they don't have to pay for it.
Yeah.
So that's nice.
Yeah.
But benevolent neglect works.
But so that's interesting. So are they are they allowing that to just carry on? Or is the city basically saying, yes, if you want to clean the park up, do it?
Yeah. Well, they send through city parks to help us. They send through the JMPD sometimes, if we ask them to. But they're quite amenable to it, which is quite nice.
Yeah, that's great.
It's an example of, in practice, solving something without trying to change the politics of who runs the city. Those are both worthwhile initiatives, and they can be separately approached. And sometimes it's useful not to approach them at the same time, because if this community initiative, who tries to solve the community's problem in that park, is at the same time trying to change who runs the city, you get opposition. So what I hear is no opposition, because you're looking at something very practical, non-threatening. Like I say, all of it's worthwhile, but sometimes it's good separating things. I'm glad to see this happening.
There's another little lesson there, which is focused action by a small group.
Yes.
So if you wait to clean up Delta Park only after you've done a referendum of, Linden and Craighall Park and,
and saved up the money to do it.
Yeah.
It's not gonna work.
Get something funded to its minimum viability. Get 3 or 4 or 10, whatever the number is. Get the equipment, get the know-how, and execute on that. And I think that's the kind of thinking that we hold dear. The minute you move into this sort of realm of public action, suddenly people lose their minds and think you need referendums, and you've got to get stakeholder buy-in from 400 people.
And millions of rands and whatever else.
And yet, if you speak to most corporate executives, when they act, it's very, very focused action. They pool resources from shareholders, or capitalize a project and focus. They don't ask the country whether they can do something. They see an opportunity, they buy a parcel of land, or they see an acquisition target, and then they go and they discuss it amongst a board of 10 people. You know, they and then they go and execute.
It's also the speed between the idea and the execution, which is very important.
Precisely. So this is an encouragement because to people, because how you would execute something in business, translate that sort of mindset over to executing on solutions in the public sphere, in civil society sphere, or in a non-profit sphere, or whatever it might be. Just go get it done, and like when businesses go and build something. Steve Jobs built some great products, and then people follow. People say, let's go do that.
I mean, I don't want to take credit. Chris Becker is running it. I helped him once as a but Chris has set the benchmark. But speaking of speed and execution, let's talk about Black economic empowerment. So before we started, Pete, you mentioned that we are like on the third wave of BEE. It's a bit like feminism. It starts off mildly okay, and then it just becomes a little bit deranged. So can you just discuss what you mean by this sort of third wave of BEE? How did it originate from it's a good idea to now where, depending on your race, you can't even trade? It's a big difference.
In the 90s, even before the 94 election, you started seeing major, what you would call today BE deals, but they weren't BE deals in the sense we know them today. They were deals, restructurings, and attempts by companies to orient themselves and integrate themselves and build goodwill and extend their networks into different communities in South Africa that were economically separated through state policy before. That was not something that started in 94. It actually happened increasingly several years already before that, because people ignored the government prescriptions and so on, even in the 80s and so on. But over time, in the 90s especially, before and after 94, there was this, what you could call a voluntary phase of BE. Companies taking initiative, and of course there were some influences and political pressure, but more broadly or less, there was no statutes that said you had to do BE in this way. Then some things changed. So in around 2000, from 1999 to 2001, around that time, there was a commission on Black economic empowerment. That commission was led by no one else than now President Cyril Ramaphosa. And the task was appointed by Thabo Mbeki. Now, the task of that commission was to evaluate BE and propose new ways forward. And it evaluated what it says was over more than 300 deals, BE deals, so-called BE deals, which was non-statutory deals, sort of voluntary rearrangements and major, like billions of rands, changing hands at the time in the 90s. Evaluated that, and it came to the conclusion that there were problems with this. It says because there's a new trend, the companies are demanding equity from the BE partners, or they're insisting in some form of management input and expertise and so on. So what that basically means was the companies were saying, okay, we're entering a phase now where there's going to be more skin in the game. We want stronger input from these new shareholders at board level or at shareholder level.
Which was obviously a very healthy evolution.
It was a very healthy evolution. It was a skin in the game phase of things. But then very explicitly, as if completely unaware of the irony, this commission, this report by President Ramaphosa is very critical of this development. And it says, to counter this development, we need to introduce statutes. And the BE Act of 2003 was the first of those statutes. So we're actually 20 years into this process now. The last few years we've moved into phase 3. But phase 2 was this period where the BE Act was in place, the Preferential Procurement Act was in place, and the character of the BE, what we know as BE during this period, was a vertical relationship. It was wherever the state acquired products from the business sector, mostly through procurement, or wherever there was a relationship with the state, a business relationship, then that was supposed to have a chain reaction through the supply development chain. But the origin of these relationships was supposedly always dealing with the state. And this referred to Section 217 of the Constitution. That was where the justification came from. And it says organs of state may procure in ways that that has some previously disadvantaged rectification measures in mind and so on. So there was some provision for that. But it's a vertical relationship. When you deal with the state, this is introduced. Now, what's happened in the last 5 years or so?
Well, since Mr. Ramaphosa became president, right?
Yeah,
Let's be honest.
yeah. Some of that, of course, has its origins before he became president, but it's really coming to fruition now. And what's happening is this vertical relationship is being transversed. Is that the right English word? It's being changed, transposed, and it's becoming a horizontal relationship. And we are seeing BE being inserted as a requirement for any business operation. So for being part of the economy, you now have to be BE.
Yes.
Where before, where you had to get something deals with the state, you had to be BE. Now, being part of the economy is becoming the BE requirement. We see this in the Competition Act. We see this in the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, which says if you want to import and export medicines, medical equipment, distribute, sell in South Africa, it's only going to service you if you have a BE certificate. We see this in the recent agricultural requirements, not only those that were published, but also those we unearthed and made public about a week ago, which is internal confidential policies, marked confidential by the department, that says that before they're going to render you a service, which is basically provide you with something that they tell you need to have, like a license or a permit, even if it has nothing to do with BE, just a sanitation certificate or an export certificate or some health clearance or something. They want to see your BE certificate, and in time they will require you to have a certain BE level. We're seeing this also in the financial services sector. To have a license to be a financial services provider, you're first going to have to do BE. Sole proprietorship, company, corporate, doesn't matter. We're also seeing this in the real estate sector, not only being an estate agent, but being a property developer. All of these are now being made subject to requirements of being BE first before you may participate in the economy. So this is a toxic mix of interventionism, Ibrahim Patel style, with BE requirements, Black Business Council, Cyril Ramaphosa style.
Can I jump in quickly?
Of course.
Let's talk about. So you've laid that out brilliantly, but let's talk about the implementation thereof, because it's easy to listen to Pete LaRue saying they're requiring this now, and then go, is that now happening? Is that now what's being required? So let's talk about the sort of overarching dynamic here. There's a lot of things sitting in this kind of pre-litigation stage where they're waiting in the wings, not been promulgated as law yet, proposals by ministers, and it's this kind of creeping. Who's going to strike first? Where's it going to come from? Was that sort of a good way to describe the landscape? No.
Yeah, let me add to that and say that when I say that this is being planned and being rolled out, doesn't mean it's being successfully done. These plans suffer from all this other symptoms of state failure. So please keep producing, keep making money, keep building wonderful businesses. We have a thriving agricultural sector, and all of these people are making money in property development in South Africa. It's not all crisis. I'm just laying out to you what's either confidentially or already openly being proposed. Some of it is being implemented, like Ibrahim Patel is wreaking havoc and is completely out of line with his public interest clauses in mergers and acquisitions. And some of it is a dead letter still. So there's a lot of litigation in the wings, and there's a lot businesses can do when the state is this weak to resist implementing. What you need to do is, Russell, you coined this term, we need to man up. What's it? Maximum achievable non-compliance.
Yeah. MAN, maximum achievable non-compliance. And I think this is critical, because a lot of this stuff, it sits in this very ambiguous pre-legislation.
And it's unlawful. Most of it, almost all of it is unlawful, challengeable.
Okay, but it gets announced. The way things get announced, and of course the way everyone reacts as well, makes these things seem like they are happening, they're imminent, this is now the thing.
Sure.
And if you're a maximum complier, you will. Many people, they feel compelled. Okay, well, just get the certificate. They're asking for certificates now. So, okay, compliance person, just get the certificate. But the certificate is the entry point.
Well, if I may interrupt, the certificate is DISCIM. a year ago saying we can't hire any more whites. The internal memo was leaked, and now they are suffering apparently from a boycott, but their share price has gone down, etc., etc.
Yeah, so-
but they didn't think that this is immoral, this is bad. It's like, okay, just comply, like just do it. And it looks like they are suffering the consequences without actually understanding.
So there's
why they
that
shouldn't.
there's that degree of kind of compliance. The compliance, and so that's part of the spectrum of compliance, no question.
Sure.
What I'm talking about in particular, though, is the guys who say, I'm going to get the BEE certificate that says 0 BEE or whatever it says on it.
I got a 0 score. I'm just going to get the certificate because that's required.
Yeah.
I see those guys. Okay.
Yeah, and so I'm not actually. Look at me. I'm not actually playing the game. Oh, but Mr. Department wants a certificate, so there you go. Well, that is the formation of a database of who's who in the zoo and who's complying and who's not. So already there, don't produce that certificate. Don't do it.
As far as possible. We realize it's a problem for some companies, but as far as possible, delay. It's an unlawful request in many instances. We're going to challenge this. If you're confronted with this and you don't want to do it, approach us and say, we'd like to help you as Sakeliga fight this. We are there. And
don't do it on command.
Don't do it on command. Yeah, let them
consider it.
Yeah.
Maximum achievable non-compliance.
It's a bit like a TV license. So I walk into the store with cash, right? Because I'm not that wealthy, but anyway. And they say, where's your TV license?
I thought super wealthy people could just walk in with cash.
No, I bought cash on purpose to just make a point. I bought a TV for a friend of mine. And I don't have a TV license. And so I came with cash. They listen, I've got this amount of money. What TV can I buy? And they show me. I spend half an hour. I really take my time. And then I say, cool, I'll buy that one, please. We go to the till. They said, oh, do you have a TV license? I said, no. So, we can't sell it. Okay, thanks, chaps. And then I just walk out. Let's say they made quite a few amends, and I managed to get the TV without a TV license.
There we go.
Yeah, it's not a requirement.
Yeah.
Like, they know it's nonsense.
Yeah.
I know it's nonsense. Everyone knows no one pays for it.
Boundaries can be tested all over the place, and certainly when it comes to compliance in these grey areas. One of the features of particularly BEE, but numerous other policies, is the degree to which corporate South Africa, particularly large corporate South Africa, has basically just thrown compliance at it.
Yep.
The lesson after 20 years since the BEE Act is you can't comply your way out of BEE because the goalposts shift.
Yes.
You're constantly drawn in until
But even
you lose
worse.
your business, until...
Sorry to interrupt, but it's even worse. We got the Investec CEO, who's a black chap, who's by all means seems rather competent at what he does. He says this is over now. The ANC needs to just stop telling business what to do. As soon as he says that, the ANC comes out and says, you're black, you're supposed to, we made you who you are. So no matter how far you comply, it's never good enough, right?
What you're hitting on there, I think, is really important. So we can talk about the 3 phases of BEE, but there's something else going on in parallel to that, which is the zeitgeist, let's say, for lack of a better word, around BEE. And so there's a Christian intellectual in the US who developed this idea of, it's a very simple idea, of positive world, neutral world, and negative world. And he was talking about how the culture perceives the Christian church. And when you're in positive world, it's very... it's a positive thing to be a Christian. You get social status from being a Christian. In neutral world, people don't mind so much. In a negative world, there's maybe persecution. It's frowned upon. You're actually regarded maybe as hateful and not a legitimate member of society. So a way of thinking about that, transpose that onto something like BE. I think we've gone through and going through a very similar thing. We were in positive world towards BE for, let's say from 1994, but even if you take the BEE Act, virtually no one of major significance opposed the BEE Act. It was actually seen as something that you achieved virtue through implementing more than you needed to. You went beyond what was required. And that, I'm just ballparking this, but that was probably the first 10 years, give or take, of after the BEE Act.
Yeah.
Let's say that takes us to 2013.
Until Zuma's first term, I would say. Yeah.
Well, so around about 2013-14 in particular, the corruption and the failure of the state becomes so manifest, and you start moving into more like a neutral world on BEE from give or take 2014 to, let's just say, 2020, somewhere around there, where you're not praising BEE anymore, but everyone's still too scared to criticize it, because that means bad things. I think we're in a negative world on BEE. I think we're moving. We're not fully in it, but I think we're moving into a negative world where it's actually okay to call a spade, to call it harmful. You've got people across the spectrum. You've just mentioned someone, white, black, colored, Indian, across the spectrum, rich, poor. People are looking at this system. Maybe they've got different diagnoses of its problems. Maybe they would replace it with, have different ideas of what to replace it with. But I wouldn't be surprised if a overwhelming majority of South Africans, in the labour markets, in the commercial sphere, broadly, at the very least, harbour, massive reservations about BEE. And I think we're moving into a situation where people, and we find this, where you can openly criticise the policy. It's harmful. Whatever laudable ends there are and there are many in terms of creating, having thriving black business communities and so on. This is not the means to that end. That is becoming something that's very easy to say. We take that for granted. Just rewind 7, 8 years, 5, 6, 7, 8 years.
That's true.
Very difficult to criticize BEE in the open, and that's changed. So we're in a negative world on BEE.
So speaking of negative world, Pete, Richard Hausman from Harvard came out and said BEE is one of the contributing factors of state failure. But I think it appears to me that the government of South Africa is trying to accelerate it as much as possible into all those examples that you put up there. Is it A, because they're going for broke before a potential coalition next year, or B, they just don't know what else to do? The grift has worked well for 30 years. Let's just accelerate it as much as possible.
So Hausman and others, they were a collection, and the recent report is actually a continuation of something that started under Thabo Mbeki. So I think the first of those reports that are related to each other came out in around 2007 or so. And already in those reports, Darren Asimoglu, which is a famous, well-known economist in the economics world, I think he's Nobel Prize winner, Asimoglu, yeah.
I think he wrote Why Nations Fail, if I remember.
Yeah, I think he wrote that and several other books. But point is, he already in the subsections in the workup to those documents, there's strong parts of it that says they recommend that as soon as possible, the ownership requirement of BEE gets jettisoned, because it's an open-ended tax on new and existing capital. That's the word I'm quoting almost verbatim from those, an open-ended tax on new and existing capital. Now, that was in positive world. That's why it didn't get the traction it did 20 years, 15 years ago. Yeah. We moved through negative world, and there was under Tito Mboweni, there was a revisit to some of Hausman and others' report, and now that was a neutral world, sort of picked up, and now in negative world, this is really picking up. And they are still, though, extending it mainly, I think in the recent report, I haven't looked at that closely, to preferential procurement, which is sort of connected, right? Now, you're asking me, are we in an accelerating phase, and why? What's the thinking behind it? Yes, we're in an accelerating phase. I don't think that it's a completely well thought out strategy as of staying in power. What it more probably is this whole structure that's developed, where political influencers who benefit from this are now in a position where they won't be, many people who got tenders, or many who were in the supply chain because some companies had to do BEE, would not have otherwise have been there were it not for BEE. The only way they can stay there is if through the Black Business Council or other entities or politicians, they start lobbying for these changes. So I think this is more a spontaneous process and a very well thought out process that we need to accelerate BEE to stay in power. I think this is the necessary consequence of trying to implement a failed policy that leads to a lot of very few people getting very rich. It creates pressures for people to try and maintain that to stay in power. Yeah, Russell, maybe you want to add to that, but I don't think it's a completely well thought out strategy. I could add that there's the Ibrahim Patel side to this, the central control. I think there's some kind of alliance between people who don't want to necessarily enrich themselves, but want to make the state control the economy, and some people who want to, looking for their next 10 million rand.
Look, I would just add to that to say that I think as funding runs out, or it's not running out, but as it diminishes significantly, something's got to keep the machine going.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's what this is. That's what NHI is. That's what and people will throw in medical care for all and all this stuff. That they of course don't believe that that's what it's going to lead to, because they're the ones who know that they can't run departments, right? So I think as funding runs out, you get this grab. So I think that's a big issue. The one thing I just wanted to we must talk about what this means. What does accelerating BEE actually mean?
Exactly.
Now it does. If it happens, it's going to do. It can do, if things get really implemented and enforced in a very draconian way, it can do a lot of harm. Before we talk about that, though, we are seeing renewed efforts to entrench preferential procurement policies, okay, which is really another angle for BEE, okay.
And this is, if I may interrupt, this is coming from the highly respected state department called the Treasury. He's always been seen as the bulwark against socialist nonsense, but now even they have bought into it.
Preferential procurement regulations were in place from 2017. Well, I mean, there's a whole act, but the very draconian regulations that Pravin Gordhan announced in 2017 were in place for 5 years. We had those declared unlawful, struck down last year, but they existed for 5 years, and most state entities operated as if they were in force of law. And what did we see? We saw a dramatic acceleration of state failure. Okay, why? Well, if you can't procure value for money services to run the apparatus of state, it's going to fail. It's going to fall over. If you've got poor, incompetent, managers of departments, plus you're spending 3 times more than you should on, mops and brooms and what else.
And you're creating this criminal class, right?
Creating a criminal class.
That kills whistleblowers, construction mafias, all the rest of it. Yeah,
so when it comes to preferential procurement policies and this renewed attempt, this is the state clearly not realizing that they're entrenching a system that is going to cause even greater acceleration of failure, which is, I mean, Pete, I don't know if you want to add to that.
My question is, surely they can see that this is the reason that they are failing, but
there's got to be
going to just double up what they're doing already. Now, it doesn't make sense in terms of a survival instinct for a party to do this.
But it feeds a patronage network over a time. Yeah, sure. But time horizons are short.
Right.
Yeah, I think it has to be like there's a time horizon thing. But also things can carry on in a very bad way, obviously bad way for a long time. Look at the Soviet Union. I mean, they kept trying failed experiments for many, many years. So somehow the power of an ideology can be strong. It's not all about grift. There are people who genuinely think that they can wrench society in this different direction, and it's going to be very harmful, but they're committed to it.
There's also something to say that the state and aspects of the state can fail, but if you're getting funds into the machine, whether it's through taxes or through patronage networks or whatever it is, but certainly even just through taxes, if you're in control of the tax machine, which is still a very well-funded machine in South Africa, all things considered.
And the most efficient one. Not by accident.
Your whole department can fail to do what it's supposed to do in whatever area you might, but you could still pay your staff. You can still have a payroll. Now, I mean, there's a limit to that, because as that all falls over, real wealth gets destroyed. So the real value of whatever nominal taxes you bring in gets destroyed, and ultimately states can go totally bust. but you could just have people on payroll doing nothing. You know, the department is failed completely, but people are getting salaries. And that works in the political calculus potentially for a lot of people, you know. So, yeah, I just think that's, but it's a fascinating development, because it's almost like there's a doom loop going on here, where as this all kind of fails, there's greater need for resource extraction to keep the machine going, which is actually, by the methods being employed, just going to create, you know, more state failure. The positive spin on this is, as that happens, as we said at the top of the show, as it were, we've got to be ready. Organizations have to be ready to respond to an acceleration of state failure. That needs to be the strategic thinking. Betting the house on the politics, you know, on everyone voting harder, and finally the politics delivering some sort of utopia or some sort of course correction, we just think is not grounded in reality.
I think so too. We're in a strange time where state failure on a governance level, it doesn't necessarily mean individual, family, community failure. They can't just shut down communications anymore. They can't take over the army. You know, before you could really shut down a country and make it really poor and really difficult to get out of. But these days, especially in South Africa, we are blessed with incompetent communists. That's my words, not Sakeliga's. And there is some benefit to that. We've got open channels of communication through social media or WhatsApp or whatever the case might be. And that alone prevents you from falling into the failure of the state. So as businesses who might or might not be with Sakeliga, governance failure is bad at a national level, but that doesn't mean you should be a failure on your own personal business level, surely.
Absolutely not. And just looking at our everyday experience, shelves are full, trucks are driving up and down, people are solving problems. Part of the business in South Africa that's booming is providing the services the state pretended to do. So there's lots of business opportunities there. There's actually some advantages in a increasingly complex environment like South Africa. It's now marginally much more difficult for someone from outside to figure out what's going on inside and move their business here. So there's even an increased threshold of being able to do business in South Africa. So once you're already here, you're now naturally protected against some competition because of just how complex things are here. So you have local tacit knowledge of what's going on. So there's obviously lots to do in South Africa. I think with regard to the state, it does require a firmer posture. It does require a posture of not complying where you can delay things, where you are asked to do unlawful things, harmful things. Don't participate in it as far as possible. I know sometimes you have to make compromises. Otherwise, 100 people who depend on you for a salary won't make it. So business is about working with the realities as they are. And the part of that reality is firming up, seizing the opportunities of state failure, and realizing that it's becoming a messy environment where things aren't always going to be clear, where you're sometimes going to solve problems without permission of the state. The example you gave earlier of people who solved the park problem in Park View, they did that seemingly with some kind of consent from the municipality. But many problems in South Africa are increasingly going to be solved without permission.
Sure.
That's messy. That's not how business is done in Germany. But that's how business is going to be done in South Africa. And people won't advertise that, but many people are already doing that. Many roads are being cleared, potholes filled, even though it's illegal. People are repairing electricity, even though that's illegal. People are doing things every day. Businesses are doing things every day that are technically not legal or they need permission for, and they're not asking it, that's the future.
Yeah.
It is.
Just to jump into that quickly, I've met some very successful local businessmen in the last little while, and it's the guys who are willing to act without permission, to do good things.
Yes.
To do good things without permission.
Things you can defend.
Things you can defend. So this is not some crazy, lawlessness strategy of, just doing whatever you want. But the way, state failure, administrative failure, some very, poorly formulated laws mean that in some sense, chaos can become codified and the norm. And to create order, you have to buck that. You have to, and that you have to do things without permission very often. And you need to act carefully. You need to act responsibly. But you can, if you can defend it, and you can, you should do those things.
In the extreme example, that's how the KZN riots got solved.
Imagine the guys in KZN said, we don't think we're allowed, by clause 3.75 to do what we're supposed to do. Yeah,
we're still waiting on Becky to reply to our WhatsApp where we asked, can we solve this?
Yeah, it says that we must wait for the police in this instance, or we're not allowed to block our road because you're not allowed to do that. Only the police may block a road. Well, if you don't block the road, everything's getting ransacked. So you do it. And my point was simply to say that what I'm seeing is that the guys who are becoming exceedingly successful in this economy are the ones who can act like that. There are also gangsters who are, I think, doing quite well.
Very much
and
so.
They're acting in a way with a similar sort of spirit, but for the bad.
Well, and they're often affiliated to politics, right?
Yeah, There's
in essence,
we know that there's connections to the political.
But the one is political, and the other one is providing a service without asking for permission. There's a tangible difference between the two.
Yeah, and just so if you are a pathological kind of complier, and you can't get your head around acting outside of some sort of permissional structure, best you maybe go and work for one of these other guys, who can act like that, because the guys who are able to act like that are cleaning up. There's a lot of money being made out there through legitimate good business, but that's the environment that we're in. It's not only unfamiliar to Germans. It's unfamiliar to a lot of South Africans. It's unfamiliar to people who've grown up in a system that they can generally trust, in a legal system that's generally rational, under a state and a criminal justice system and what have you, a policy environment that's generally rational. Facing a system that is backed by state power, which, whatever we say about state failure, is still substantial power. The power to do a lot of things. Backing that is a big leap for people, and that's why institutions are so important, because to do that on your own entirely is very difficult. There's a few very brave, very skillful large businessmen who are able to act in very, very skillful ways in this regard, but most people need an institution. Now, I mean, is that my naked plug for Sakeliga? But my point is, you can't do this kind of thing alone. What can a Sakeliga bring to the table? Well, there are certain realms where people actually need to act in this way, but they are in fact barred by law or legislation or regulation that does prohibit action. It does make them susceptible to risk. It's all well and good saying, just go and do your thing, but you might run into a conscientious politician or magistrate who says no, can't do that. And our job is through litigation, in part. There's other parts to our strategy, but through our litigation process is to try and pave that way clearer, so that people can act in their best interests. So we can actually push those laws aside, because laws hold a very strong ethical weight.
Mm.
They just do.
Yes, irrespective of how good or bad they are.
Irrespective of how good or bad they are. When this government said you have to wear a mask, and if you don't, you are liable to arrest and potentially prison, it's compelling, because I don't want to go to jail, and I don't want to run into that conscientious policeman who's got an axe to grind and he's going to follow it through just because I didn't put the mask on. So the whole country wore masks, and I'm telling you, it's because of that threat of arrest that it was made an ordinance. So that realm is powerful, and we don't just want to dismiss it as, well, just obey what you feel like, kind of thing. We need to act through high impact, focused litigation, to kind of remove some of these barriers. And we're getting it, we're starting to get that right. We've got some great wins under the belt there. And that's the institutional capacity that can start to enable the little guy, the individual, to then go and act. Because most guys don't have the stomach to take on the kind of legal and let's say, regulatory risk, as it were, to act like this.
And it's not only even about the stomach; it's also often unwise to, on your own, take on Leviathan. It's an unstandable position.
Look at Hugh Glenister, right? He spent millions of rands to make the Hawks the Scorpions or something like that, and he got it. He didn't win in the end. Cost him 10 million rand. I mean, kudos, he tried, but it didn't get very far.
Yeah. So there's also the kind of legal strategy you employ, and the kind of questions you ask the courts, and that's a whole story. But yes, I mean, I think bottom line is we're in unfamiliar territory to most people. That's not going to change anytime soon. People need to really think deeply and carefully about the kind of world that we're in. Maximum achievable non-compliance on harmful interventions is absolutely the right sort of approach. And okay, what does that mean in practice? Yeah, it's tricky. There's different realms where it means different things.
Sure.
So we can't answer that around this table, but start trying to answer it. If you're a business out there, who's got the answer? If you've got a representative organization, let's say you're a farmer and you are part of one of the agri organizations, how are they talking about this stuff? Are they advising maximal compliance, or are they starting to talk maximum achievable non-compliance, and starting to put pressure on policymakers to make that possible for their members? Is that what's going on? And if not, why not? So it's also to say to companies, don't only think about where you can not comply with harmful things. If you're part of industry groupings, what's the spirit there? Is it to go along and try and comply your way out of this these let's call them internal economic sanctions, or is it to actually take a stand in an organized way? These are critical commercial questions these days.
So one last question from me, and especially to you, Pete. So we often on Morning Shot we make this argument that South Africa is almost 30 years ahead from the rest of the Western world. Not in terms of collapse or things like that, but in terms of ideology. Joe Biden has an executive order for diversity in all spheres of the federal government. The Brits are mandating diversity quotas in every sphere, from the public to the private sphere. It's almost ANC ideology, but by governments who are a lot more competent and who have a far deeper state than we do. Do you think that this sort of thing, we are the canary in the coal mine in South Africa in a very particular way? I'm not saying everything will be South Africa, but we are 30 years ahead of where these other countries are currently, and we could generally have these lessons to give out to those countries in time to come.
Yeah, in some ways, South Africa is ahead of the curve. It's not completely the same.
Sure.
I think what's happening in most of the West, especially because much of what we see with wokeism and so on is a crisis of a Western kind. It's a crisis of the individual in relation to his place in community within modernity, and that has all sorts of pathologies. There are some of that in South Africa as well, But I think what I've found a very illuminating description was the one by Arnold Toynbee I think it was in the 1950s, early 1950s. Toynbee was a British historian. Toynbee replied to a journalist asking him about his views on South Africa, and the journalist asked him, the Afrikaners just gained control, this national party, what advice do you have, sort of what are your remarks? And Toynbee said something along the lines of, well, interestingly, you in South Africa are faced with a condition, a challenge that will soon be felt around the world, and that is the annihilation of distance between very different peoples and cultures through the application of Western technology. That's not the exact words, but that was more or less it. And I think that's the sense in which we are ahead of the curve. We have lots of communities in South Africa, but the lasting aspect of colonialism is, of course, that we're trying to forge one nation and one state. That's the most lasting and obvious aspect of colonialism, is this idea that from around Europe there will be these states and they are sovereign and they are final and their borders are, within them there are no distinctions, and so this project of South Africa is in some sense now a similar problem for what's going on in England or any country in Europe or the West, in some places elsewhere in the world, but mostly we're seeing the greatest change in population dynamics currently, let's say in Europe or in the US, with people from South America moving into the US. So it's very much a traditionally a Western area problem of people in new cultures, languages, religions entering these domains. So in that aspect, we are ahead of the curve. Now, South Africa is in an advanced state of state failure, and some of that has to do with the problems of not having institutions set up to deal with these differences, and finding ways to harmoniously arrange them so that they can complement instead of distract from each other. So that's some of my remarks. I think, though, that I have one more point on this. I think that the advantage of this is, though, that we, unlike maybe similar organizations or civil society organizations or business groups elsewhere in the world, realize that the state is not the only possible answer to solving that. So most entities in Europe trying to solve the problems there are saying we need to gain control of the state, or we need to get the people in the state to think differently, and then through that we affect change. So their theory of change is theory of change through the state, and our theory of change is direct change from the ground up. And that's a difference that I think will suit them well in a few years to adopt, but they're not there, and we have that advantage, and that's a hopeful realization, a strategic insight that we have that we can use.
One last question for you, Russ. The West, well, not the West, the world, it seems to be having a revitalization of, let's call it conservatism. You get these right populists like Wilders in the Netherlands, Viktor Orban in Hungary, places like that. Are these useful to South Africa, or don't we matter like at all? I'm not saying that these people should care about us. Bukele from El Salvador or Miele from Argentina. I'm not saying we should care about. They should care about us at all. But is there some sort of hopeful change that will come here in a decade or two, or should we just ignore it and just focus on the work?
Firstly, they don't care about us.
True.
Bombshell. But that's true. I say that South Africa has a symbolic kind of importance to some people around the world, not entirely unrelated to some of the things Pete's just spoken about. South Africa has been seen as a project, and the new South Africa is seen by was seen by Western elites as a project, and the extent to which that project succeeds or fails, I think, does matter to them. Yeah. So we matter more than my sort of comment maybe suggests, but in the main, especially your sort of, let's call it, second tier countries, they're focused on their own stuff. They've got big problems, whether it's Bukele trying to fix crime or anyone else trying to solve that problem now. He seems to have got it right, at least for now. whether it's the Hungarians trying to grapple with their relationship with Europe and Russia and immigration and so on. I just think everyone is focusing on their own patch right now. Yes, America has the luxury of still this very kind of global vision, and the EU and some of these larger, Western powers, let's say. But the trend is very inward looking. And I just think everyone is so particular. Everyone's got such unique sets of circumstances, So, what does it mean? What is a conservative or right wing political party in South Africa even look like? Does it transcend racial boundaries? Is conservatism in South Africa inherently a kind of ethnocentric thing that actually tries to cultivate different communities and self-governance and so on. So I just think we have a very unique set of problems. A lot of those other movements as well are very nationalistic, and sometimes that's achievable in a place like Hungary because it is a kind of ethno state, right?
Everyone's Hungarian.
Everyone's
yes.
Hungarian, at least
mostly.
my understanding, mostly.
Yeah.
South Africa is, as Pete said, the defining feature of our country is that it's diverse, but that actually means something. It means something very real and important for political arrangements.
No, in the real sense of the word, yeah.
So we are very unique. So I'm not sure. Look, I think the global tide always matters for small countries in various ways that are hard to articulate. So, I think if the world's going hell for leather down a kind of, very globalist and sort of liberal globalist direction, or it's going for a more reactionary or conservative direction, or it's rebelling against X, Y, or Z, that those ripples definitely hit us in various ways. I'm not sure though that I am sure that as an organization, we wouldn't look at that stuff and go, oh, sure, our strategy needs to be tweaked in this way. I mean, mostly there might be some exceptions there, but basically,
so you're aware of it.
We're aware of it.
It doesn't impact what you do.
I think South Africa's and always, by the way, has been, and this is something that R.W. Johnson always made a point of, is we're a parochial country. We are inward looking. We're far away from physically from a lot of the world, and we really do have a unique and difficult set of challenges here. And so I just think we need to kind of keep our eye on the ball as to what needs to be achieved here. I think living sort of vicariously through American or Hungarian or British or French or German conservative politics is actually going to distract us. It's going to keep us on our phones and kind of rooting for our guy over there, and who's taking dominion here, who's claiming back space for order here.
Ignore the globalist reality show. Let's just do some work here.
Let's get on with it.
Very good. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. As you can see, it was a very long podcast. We do this for you. Hope you found it very interesting. If you want to be part of Sakeliga, something I would highly recommend, please do check out the links in the description down below. And I just want to thank my co-host today for inviting me to the lovely studio. And exciting times. Elections are important, but taking action is even more important, as someone famous once said. Thanks for watching. Cheers.